Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today you're going to have a special treat. I recorded a podcast a little while ago with a fella named Romulo, who is Brazilian and by way of Oxford, that is Oxford, England, where he holds from where he obtained a PhD in evolutionary biology. So in this creation series, what we've tried to do is find the best experts possible in various fields. And at some point, one of my supporters reached out and said, listen, it's going to sound crazy. There's a PhD in evolutionary biology who obtained his certifications from Oxford University, arguably the most prestigious university in the world, in the very field of study that has to do with evolution. And he is here to tell you that there are reasons to doubt the theory of evolution based on the strict scientific data that is widely known in the field. So I reached out and we had a conversation, and he graciously came on my show. Now, a little while ago, there were, certain Catholic apologists and influencers who took issue with my creationism and tried to rake me over the coals for being, a bumbling fundamentalist. Well, although I'm sure these men are much smarter than I don't think that their intellects in this capacity could hold a candle to the certification and background of the individual I speak to in this show. Call me crazy, but I do think that someone with the highest degree possible from arguably the most prestigious university in the world, in the very field of evolutionary biology, probably has a better grasp on the science than talking heads from places like Catholic Answers. I'm just saying that's probably the case. So I look forward, my friends, to your debunking videos showing why I'm such a bumbling fundamentalist. Now, I will say as well before we continue, the opinions of Mr. Romulo are his own, and they are not those of any institution he represents. I want to make that very clear. It is him as a private individual having a conversation as a Catholic who happens to have a background in this field. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as always, enjoy the show. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here with Dr. Ralu, Brazilian, coming to us from merry old England, the mother country of my country of Canada. And I'm very excited to talk with this friend of mine today about evolutionary theory from a Catholic perspective, and actually basically just kind of the science behind it, and why someone who has a PhD from Oxford in evolutionary biology can actually say with confidence that there's probably some monkey business, pun intended, going on with evolutionary theory. Dr. Ralu, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Yes, I am an evolutionary biologist. I'm a mainstream scientist. I have a PhD in zoology from the University of Oxford. I did a master's degree back in Brazil in one of the federal universities we have there. I studied 1 year in the United States in a Florida International University, did a one internship at Yale University, and now I'm working as a geneticist in Kew Gardens in London, working with disease in plant. Interestingly enough, I was raised Catholic, but I apostatized very early on when I was around 13. And of course, going to academia, that atheism got solidified, and I became a pure materialist. And I only came back to the faith like less than 5 years ago, halfway through my PhD, mostly through, of course, the grace of God, but the secondary cause that he used, beside a bunch of things, was Thomistic philosophy and Aristotelian metaphysics as well. So that was very important to me in studying that. And just to make a quick disclaimer, some of the things I'm going to say here, they are my personal view. They do not represent necessarily the institutions that I work for or the institutions that I've worked previously. But yeah, happy to be here.
Excellent. So that's a pretty crazy story, going through the secular institutions. I know Brazil is traditionally a Catholic country, but I know that, like everybody else, everywhere else in the Western world, there's a lot of problems with modernism and so forth in the church. and then to go through Yale and Oxford and come out with a very controversial opinion about evolution, which is kind of the main dogma of the materialist world we live in. That is pretty incredible. And I commend you for it, because I would imagine that every once in a while there might be difficulties with holding that position. But you're here to tell us that these critiques you have of evolutionary theory are actually just based in sound science. It's not, we don't have to appeal to the Bible. In fact, for the viewers, Romulo is going to talk to us from the perspective of an old Earth perspective, because we know that in the sort of world of, let's call it, creationist evolutionary dialogue, when someone says that they believe the world is, 10,000, 600,000 years, 6,000 years old or whatever, then of course they're just going to be dismissed anyway. But you can actually show what you need to show and talk about it from the perspective of, playing by their rules. So whatever you want to do, let's get into it.
Yeah, I think for the viewers, the most important thing to understand is that the word evolution is extremely equivocal. So when there is a conversation between scientists and the layperson, sometimes there are, a lack of an overlap, and sometimes even within the academia, evolution can mean different things. So when we say, and we hear a lot, and I've had this conversation with many people, when a scientist says that evolution is a fact, what he is actually saying is that he's basing his definition of evolution on population genetics. So he's pretty much saying that it is a fact that changes in allele frequencies happen over time. Alleles are just ladders of the DNA, so to speak, and genes have different variants. Like, you remember that from probably high school, when you have the big A or the small a. So there are variations within the genome, and over time these changes can occur, and this is observable, right? The Darwin finches, for example, when you have the changes in beak size over time, if those changes are genetic, if there's something genetic about the bird that makes the beak be that certain size, and the beak is increasing over time because it's adaptive, therefore there would be a change at the genetic level over time, what we call the change in allele frequencies. So if that's evolution, then of course this happens, right? But when we speak about evolution with someone outside the academia, actually, let me just show the slides real quick. That's probably going to be helpful. So I just made this diagram, right? So you have within the ellipse, you have what we call the Neo-Darwinian or modern synthesis view, which is the most accepted version of evolutionism within the academia, right? There are other versions that are coming up, which maybe I'm going to speak later. But you have, within the Neo-Darwinian framework, you have the causes of evolution. For example, mutations, natural selection, drift. These causes lead to change in trait frequencies over time, or the allele frequencies. I usually use trait because it's easier to understand, like the beak size, for example, but usually it has to be at the genetic level, which is the effect. And then if you have that happening over long periods of time, you're going to lead to speciation. So if you have two populations, they get separated, let's say two birds, and they are, there are different kind of seeds that they can feed from in the different islands. Perhaps larger beaks in one island are going to be favored. Smaller beaks in another island are going to be favored. If they remain separate, maybe they're going to diverge. Some of these birds are going to have larger beak over time, and the other smaller beak. And if these changes are dramatically at the evolutionary level or ecological level, whatever, then a scientist would probably argue that we have now two different species, right? And that would be the speciation, right? The problem is, as I said, usually, just to give an example, there is one mechanism we hear a lot about natural selection, but for example, genetic drift is another mechanism for genetic change over time, right? So for example, imagine you have a population of beetles, they're the same species, that you have individuals that are brown, other individuals are green. And by pure chance, you're walking down your alley and you step on these beetles by pure accident, and you happen to kill more green beetles than brown beetles, right? Now, if the color of these beetles is caused by a variant at the gene level, there will be a change in allele frequency just by this killing of the green beetles, because now the frequency of the green allele goes down, right? For an evolutionary biologist, this example that I've just given, it's an evolutionary change, right? So by accidentally killing beetles, you cause an evolutionary change, okay, in a population. So I think any person would be completely comfortable in accepting this kind of process as, true. The thing is, when you're a layperson, when someone speaks to you about evolution, what you usually think is this, right? You think that life started 3.8 billion years ago in a pond, and from that molecule, the first cell, the LUCA, everything else evolved slowly, right? And I think many scientists would be comfortable to say that that's also evolution, right? And some of them would say that that process that I've just described of changes in allele frequencies over time is able to cause all this divergency, right? So you have this, people talking past each other, right? Because, if I'm thinking of this graph or this tree, and someone tells, well, I know evolution is a fact, but they're thinking on simply allele frequencies changing over time, you see that there is a mismatch in the conversation, right? So I hope I made myself clear, right? So
Yeah,
the
can I
thing
just
is
can I just ask I
mm,
want to ask a qualifier because when I hear this information, I think of terms. So there's like what we would call microevolution or adaptation, and then we have the macro. So I think everybody totally is fine with this idea that various species of plants and animals and humans, they adapt to their surroundings, and certain characteristics don't make it, whether by usefulness or just chance, like being stepped on by somebody's dress shoe as a beetle. Then you're going to have a change. But that's a very different thing than you step on a bunch of beetles and then the beetles become a butterfly. That's a different kind of change. And am I onto something there with that distinction?
yeah, that's great that you brought it up, because again, the microevolution discussion is again equivocal. It depends who you talk to, right? So in fact, by pure chance, my next slide, I think, may have to do something about it. Yes. So this was not by design, by the way. Just the question was good. So if you look at your left, I took this figure from the paper that is described on the top, right? This is what we call a hybrid zone. These are when you have different species of, like in this case, birds. It's the common sparrow in the middle, or actually on the top, and then you have other species of sparrow down there. So hybrid zones are the regions where the two populations of the different species they meet, and on that zone, which is represented by the more shaded colors, you have a mixture between the two species. They leave descendants, and if you do some DNA testing, you're going to figure out that there is some genetic material flowing from one population to the other, right? So why I'm showing you this? Why I'm showing you this is because if you look at these three birds, they are considered different species. They're not subspecies. They're different species according to people who classified this. So for many scientists, the production of a new species is macroevolution, right? So under this definition, I think even you would be comfortable to accept that one bird coming, this birds diverging from an ancestral population can happen, right? And the funny thing is, if you take these two sparrows, the one on the top and the bottom that I pulled the arrows from, and I went to this website, Time Tree, that shows you the divergent. When did it happen that these two birds shared a common ancestor? The common ancestor of these two birds was calculated to be around 1.6 million years ago. What that means is that it took 1.6 millions for these birds on the top and the bottom to diverge to this point, which is pretty much what coloration difference, right? So if you are defining macroevolution as speciation, then this is macroevolution, then I think most Catholics would be comfortable with that. Other people make a distinction. They say, no, macroevolution is when you have a very dramatic change, let's say in body form, like in what we call bowel plan, for example, right? Like an insect and, I don't know, a dinosaur and a bird, rather than just two species of sparrow, right? So again, how you're going to define species will define whether you're comfortable with macroevolution or microevolution, okay? And this is very important because, again, this is not clarified in most conversations.
Now, with these sparrows, because I've also heard it, I had a conversation one time with a
You're muted.
oh, sorry, there you go. I had a conversation one time with this evolutionist type who thought I was a silly creationist or whatever. And he wanted to show me why I didn't know what I was talking about. So I knew my stuff. I mean, I'm not studied in it, but I can read and write, and I can walk and chew gum. So I can do this thing called reading books and reading articles, and it's amazing when you actually do that. You can learn things. And just as an aside, I can't stand when people say to me, "You're not a scientist. You can't talk about evolution." If being a scientist was necessary to understand evolution, then no one could become an evolutionist because no one's a scientist before they are one. Yet somehow they go through university and they pass their courses, and on that way they learn the information and they get the certification at the end. So this is a non sequitur. Nonetheless, one of his things saying to me, well, he gave me this mouse study where basically what they did is they took a population of mice and they kind of split them up. Or they took one, I don't know if it was 50-50, but they took one group and then they interbred or inbred essentially the tar out of the one group. And then over time, mice can regenerate so quickly. It didn't take very long, but, let's say dozens and dozens of generations. Then it got to the point where the one group of mice could no longer breed with the other group of mice. And he said, see, that's macroevolution. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, I thought, no, that's just the result of inbreeding. It seems strange to me. But what you're saying is that for some, that would constitute a new species. But I'm thinking to myself, these are both just mice. It's just that because of some characteristics of environment that are contrived, by the way, and they're not natural, now they just can't breed with each other. Is it fair to say that for the average person and sort of who studies the animal kingdom, if an animal can breed with another animal, would we say they're part of the same species, or is it even less, or are there species that breed with other species according to the minds of mainstream evolution?
Um, you know, One of the problems, again, with the species concept is that we have more than 30 concept of species. And one of the reasons for that, if you go back to Darwin, you already see that in Darwin, right? If you go back to the Aristotelian metaphysics, there are things with essences, and these essences have boundaries that cannot be breached by accidental change, right? For Aristotle, the species were eternal, for example. But uh, Darwin makes biology be about populations. So if our populations are constantly changing over time, then they do not have identity that is fixed. They're constantly changing. They can have like a temporal identity for a bit, but they can become something else at any point because they're changing, right? So that creates a problem of classification. So how are you going to classify a species, right? The sparrow example, that's why there are many times people just change what is a subspecies to a species, or depending on the criteria. And that comes from this kind of more like an Heraclitus view. Everything's changed. There's no permanence, right? Sorry, I got sidetracked by my historical account. So can you remind me what your
Yeah,
question was?
I was just saying. So, with these sparrows, like, can those sparrows breed with the other sparrows who are
Oh yeah, yeah.
technically a different species?
Okay. So that's a thing. So as I showed from the hybrid zone, uh, most biologists would be comfortable calling two species that can still interbreed. They would just say that the reproductive isolation between those two species is not fully complete for a reason. So in the hybrid zones, they can still survive. So they would claim that species can. We have the proper term for this. We call introgression, right? And people have to understand as well that, again, because of what speciation is about, this reproductive isolation can happen even in one or a few generations. So, for example, in plants, it's very common for the whole genome to duplicate. So, for example, with oaks are diploids like us, right? They have two sets of chromosomes. Okay, that's what it means. Some oaks are triploids. They have an extra pair of chromosome because some genome duplication happened at one point. So sometimes when you have that happening, in the same generation, the triploids, I'm not saying that happens for oak, but it happened for other plant species, that they cannot breed anymore because there is an incompatibility between the gametes, right, the reproductive cells. So, yesterday these two populations were the same. Then you have one event of a duplication. Suddenly they cannot reproduce anymore. Are you going to call them different species? I think many biologists would be comfortable saying so because they're reproductively isolated. If you come from a philosophical perspective, would you? I mean, it's effectively the same it's the same organism with an extra set of genes, of chromosomes. So it all gonna boils down to how you define species and your philosophical underpinnings. But yeah, I would say on a Thomistic metaphysics that if they can interbreed, they're most likely the same species, right?
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That clears a lot of things up because, I mean, in this conversation about evolution, if you're talking to somebody who has a different definition about what a species is, then I mean, you're really not going to get anywhere.
No.
And especially if there's not the same metaphysical language employed. Anyway, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, this is not my definition. Like, as I said, there are 30 concepts of species, and I think Ernest Mayr, which was a very famous evolutionary biologist, I think, he got famous also for defining the concept of, I think it's called, I forget if it's the biological concept of species, but he defines that, if two populations can leave fertile offspring, then they are the same species. So, this concept it's out there. But as I said, the problem is are two species which cannot interbreed different species, two populations that cannot interbreed two different species. As I said, it can happen from one generation to another. So again, as an evolutionary biologist, perhaps it's useful to classify them as different species, but on a philosophical sense, would you call them different species? Probably not, right?
Right, right. So, what else do you think we should discuss?
I think there's also a misunderstanding of what evolutionary biologists called a beneficial mutation, right? And because one thing that people have to understand is that the concept of selection cannot have any meaning without mutations happening first. Because, in fact, can you take the slide out? Because that's actually more important to discuss. The natural selection is something that, again, people get it wrong all the time, right? They think it's some sort of force that can shape the organisms to the environment. When what we actually selection is just a consequence of, for example, the example I gave about the Darwin finches, right? The fact that some organisms have a larger beak and they're able to break seeds and eat them and survive more and leave more descendants, the fact that they are leaving more offspring is natural selection, right? It's just increase in the allele frequency over time, or the beak size over time. But in order to explain that, the most important thing is not why adapted organisms are leaving more offspring. What you actually want to know is how they became adapted in the first place. How do their beaks increased? Why do they have beaks to begin with? And the only source of new variation, it's mutations, right? So you have to explain why are some beaks larger than the others. So for that, you have to explain, either, at the genetic level. And mutations do not happen to help the organism, right? They are there are errors in gene in genome replication, right? So you have your cell when it needs to replicate. Sometimes the duplication makes a mistake, right? The enzymes involved and the proteins involved. Just to give you one example, in Escherichia coli, is estimated that the mistakes that the molecular machines make. So they let pass one mistake in the ladder of the bacteria DNA, one mistake every 1 billion ladders, right? So these things are ridiculously very rare because they're repair systems. So the bacteria does not want to mutate, right? It wants to replicate its DNA faithfully. So there are a bunch of different molecular machines and enzymes to prevent the replication from making mistakes. And sometimes a few escape. So when we talk about beneficial mutations, so for example, antibiotic resistance, right? What people tend to think as a layperson is that, oh, the bacteria has got antibiotic resistance. That means that the bacteria gained some sort of novel characteristic that it made it be able to fend off the antibiotic. What actually happens, like for antibiotics, for example, what you have is one of the most common ways of a bacteria to be immune to antibiotic is to pump the antibiotic out of the cell. You have these efflux pumps. So bacteria can, by a mutation, express the genes that make the pumps more. So the bacteria have more of the pumps in the cell wall, and because it has more, it's more likely that it's going to be able to pump the antibiotic out before it causes any damage. That's one of the mechanisms. So you see that you're not actually the bacteria is not making anything new. It's overly expressing a gene that produces more pumps that are already there, and therefore it becomes resistant, right? And that's why antibiotic resistance can happen so quickly, sometimes even over a period of 3 years, because bacteria, they reproduce very quickly. You have, their population size are ridiculously big. So by pure chance, you can have mutations that will, let's say, prevent, because you have, mechanisms within the cell that prevent the gene from being expressed, because you don't want genes being overly expressed all the time. So by mutating that and preventing that stop, and the gene is now overly expressed, you can make more pumps in the cell, right? So that's why it can happen so quickly, because all it takes is breaking a gene in order to get the other gene overly expressed, right? So that's usually what we call a beneficial mutation. So I have another example,
Sure.
but is it?
Yeah. Just let's break that down for a second, because if the idea
Mhm.
behind evolutionary theory is that there's beneficial mutations, I mean, just bringing it back to a Catholic perspective, even just a basic perspective of anyone who believes in a creator, because in the church, I mean, there are a lot of these dogmas, these things that we're supposed to believe as Catholics, of course, and God is creator. This is infallible. I mean, this is Vatican I, anathematized, all these kinds of things. The opposites are anathematized. I mean, so I don't even think we can say that the mutation is even creative. It's not even like it's a creative mechanism. It's more of something that's already there, and also in many cases there are mutations which are actually detrimental to the species. So even this common parlance about mutations are causing this evolution, which presupposes something going towards a better way of being, that doesn't really even fit the scientific literature, or at least the scientific hypothesis. So if we then apply that thing to a divine creativity, it doesn't really seem in line with creativity as such. Does that make sense?
Yes. Of effect, like objectively speaking, mutations are errors,
Yeah.
right? They are the only time that I'm aware of that a mutation, like what bacteria can do, for example, they can induce mutations to be higher in frequency. So let's assume you have an environment that is extremely stressful, and the bacteria cannot cope with that. Some bacteria can turn off the repair mechanism and let mutations happen. It's almost like a jackpot kind of scenario. You want to mutate because you want to hopefully make a mistake that is actually going to make you survive more. That's the only scenario that I can imagine that a mutation is usually desirable. But let me show you the slides that I think it's going to help people understand what I mean. Because, mutations, what exactly are mutations, right? So if you take like the DNA level, you have, the nucleotides, you have 4 nucleotides, the letters of DNA. And this in the cell nucleus, you're going to have the transcription of DNA into an RNA, and then this RNA is going to leave the cell, and then it's going to go to a ribosome, simplifying the process, and it's going to make a protein, right? So every 3 letters produces an amino acid that's going to be the building block of the protein, right? So mutations are just, these changes in the nucleotides at the DNA level will sometimes change the protein, right? Because you're changing the 3 letters, and you have mutations that may not cause anything because, like, for example, on your left, you have TTC, which leads to a lysine at the end. But because there is redundancy in the genome, so more than one combination of letter can lead to the same amino acid, there is some buffer, right? That's another mechanism to prevent mutations from causing problems. Because of the redundancy, some mutations will not cause a change in the protein. Some will cause, for example, a stop codon. So, it's just going to make the ribosome stop the protein block. So that's stop the protein from being constructed because it tells it you should stop here. And you have other changes that will change the amino acid, right? So what evolutionary biology is hoping for is that some of these changes that will affect the protein will be adaptive. The protein will be somehow better than the previous protein and confer some advantage to the organism, right? So the best example of a beneficial mutation that we have, there is a very, very impressive experiment by the Lansky group in the United States that they've been reproducing Escherichia coli, the bacteria, for more than 35 years, I think now. So they have 12 flasks, and they let the bacteria evolve naturally. And when the bacteria are getting, the population is getting too big, they swap the flasks. So imagine they've been doing that for 35 years, right? Some flasks, they have some. So the whole idea here is to let them evolve naturally. The only thing that they do is that some flasks, they don't have some nutrients, but they don't do anything experimental to change the population, right? They just let them evolve naturally. And it takes a monumental effort to swap the flask for over 35 years. So in the most impressive change that happened was that, after 31,000 generations, which is roughly 1,000,000 years in human terms, for bacteria, because they reproduce much faster. One of the populations, they call it evolved the ability to feed on citrate, right? That's how it was, this is a New Scientist, this is a popular magazine, it's not a scientific popular, but they describe it as evolved the ability to feed on citrate. If you read that, you're going to think, as I said before, that this bacteria is gaining a property that it didn't have before, right? That's how it sounds. What effectively is happening is that Escherichia coli, they can't always eat citrate. They already have the capacity to do so. The problem is citrate is an awful source of carbon. So they don't like to eat citrate. They usually eat glucose, right? But if the medium is very stressful and there's not the food that the bacteria likes, for example, when there is lack of oxygen, the lack of oxygen triggers at the genetic level the expression of genes that are now enable the bacteria to eat citrate. So when it's stressful, it will eat it because it has nothing better to eat, right? So usually this gene is only triggered when there is lack of oxygen. In this population, after 31,000 generation, they started doing that no matter the circumstances. They were doing it even when there was oxygen present, right? So when you look at actually at the molecular level, what's going on, it was more than one mutation. There was some quite interesting changes going on there that I'm not going to get into details. But what happened there was that the repressor of the genes involved with the citrate digestion, so to speak, got broken. It's like, imagine if there's how you call this, the flick, right? An interrupter or whatever, a switch, sorry, that is, it only turns on when there is lack of oxygen. Now this bacteria, the switch is just on all the time, and it can eat citrate no matter the conditions. But it's a broken bacteria because it broke the gene, and of course the controller is there for a reason. But in the flask in question, there was no glucose. It was a stressful flask. So for that specific environment, there was no good food to eat. Breaking the genes was helpful, and this bacteria started growing a lot, right? But when they put those bacteria back in a not back, but when they compare these bacteria with the non-mutated bacteria in a regular environment, they did much worse, right? Because they were effectively broken. Yeah. But in that very specific scenario, having this mutation or more than one mutation that stopped the citrate genes, from being, silenced, it was beneficial, right? So the analogy I like to give is that, but imagine you have a race of 3 cars, and they're identical, and they're tied, and they're about to get to the finish line, right? And suddenly, one of the cars loses the hind wing, right, which gives downforce. And now this car goes a bit faster because it doesn't have the wing producing aerodynamic pressure, right? And it wins the race. You could say that to win the race, it was beneficial that he lost the wing. However, if there was one more lap, if this car tried to turn at high speed, he would not be able to do so effectively because he lost the wing, because the wing there is there for a reason, right? So when we say mutations are beneficial, what we're saying is that they increase the odds of the population or the individual to survive at that specific environment. But it doesn't mean that that is good on a more, metaphysical level. It's just that you broke something. This organism is now increasing in number, but as I said, if you put it back to the good environment with good food, it cannot do as well, right? And trying to fix the mutation, it's very difficult, and depending on the number of mutations, is almost impossible probabilistically. So the organisms are broken, right? So this is usually what we call beneficial mutations, right? So whether you can build an organism by doing that, right? It's another question. Okay.
Yeah, that's hardly. I mean, what we're talking about here is a stressful environment, and something stressful's happened, and you figure out how to cope. I mean, people do this all the time. You go somewhere where they've got different types of foods, and you get sick for the first few months. Then eventually, your stomach can deal with whatever's in the water, kind of thing. This is hardly you becoming a better eater. This is you being able to eat in a less an environment that is not conducive, generally speaking, to your thriving. So again, it's just something like an adaptation to circumstance. This is, no one is going to deny this as being something like some sort of evolution, so to speak, in the sense that there's been a change that helps something survive in a certain place. But it's a far cry to go from this to, some sort of hominid creature births something that's a completely different species. This is where, you mentioned this study of 35 years. Well, that's good to see there's been a 35-year study, because that's a long study. But even in a study like this with very simple organisms, we see nothing that even looks closely resembled to what is claimed in the mainstream.
Yeah, and that's why there are, under this paradigm of changes in allele frequencies over time, even within the academia, there are frictions. There are, mainstream scientists like myself who are not satisfied with that explanation. And, there is a big move now for an extended synthesis of evolution that will incorporate other kind of causes, because many, to be fair, there's still a minority, but they're saying, look, we're dealing with this paradigm that comes from the early 90s, right, which comes from population genetics. And clearly, even if you think philosophically speaking, let's just, in terms of definition, if evolution is the change in allele frequency over time, which is just variation of the same gene, right? Therefore, by definition, changes in allele frequency can never be the cause of a gene, right? And it can never be the cause of the machinery that is responsible for, expressing the gene. So for you to even speak of changing allele frequency over time, you already have to have in place a whole genome with the whole set of, the cell, the structure of the cell, all the machinery responsible for reading and expressing those genes. So even in principle, with that definition, you cannot explain this kind of things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a student, I used to be a high school teacher. And then one of the things I got in most trouble for was I was teaching religion in a Catholic school, and I was teaching about, creation. And I was just showing that, maybe there's another side to the story. And I had one student who was very smart. She was one of those kids who just speeded, she sped through high school and graduated early and was, went off some super smart degree somewhere. And she thought she had me. She said, "Well, Mr. Hall, anything is possible with enough time. If you put laundry in a laundry machine and it spins for enough cycles, the mathematics shows us that at some point it's going to come out folded." And I said, "Okay, well, who made the laundry machine and who made it spin in one direction and who turned it on?" And she kind of laughed and she went, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "So even in this world where you're going to postulate that something can happen, and again, laundry folding is not the same thing as creating a new species, but even if you can postulate something like that, you're going to have to come back to this position where there's already an order set in place, which is fixed. And if it's not fixed, you can't even have the thing that you're calling evolution, but you can't evolve yourself to that fixed thing in the first place. There's always this contradiction that you find."
Yes. Even the fact that we are able to say that a mutation is an error already presupposes a certain sort of teleology, right? There is something aiming towards a certain end, in this case, uh, correctly replicating the DNA. And because it fails to do so, we're able to say, wow, there is a mutation there. So this problem of teleology and goal directness, and it's so prevalent that recently, I think 2021, the Linnean Society, you can look this up. I watched it. I was watching it live. The Linnean Society, which is one of the most important scientific societies in the UK, together with the Royal Society, they had a whole conference on teleology. They call it teleonomy, and you're discussing exactly the idea of goal directedness, because it's impossible to talk about biology without making reference to teleology, right? You cannot describe what a heart is without making reference to what it is, what is the function, and without making reference to the whole, right? It is an organ that pumps blood, let's just say. You can try to go at the molecular level or a tissue level, try to explain what a heart is. You're never going to be able to. You need to make reference to the end. And so you have this mainstream scientists, discussing goal directness in biology, but of course they are trying to naturalize it. So I recommend your viewers to look it up. It's online in YouTube. You can find a Linnean Society, Teleonomy Agency and Evolution, something like that. So there is a quite of an interesting change that is happening. Aristotle is being resurrected. I spoke to many philosopher biologists, many of them atheists, and they're just realizing that there's something fundamentally wrong about this materialistic reductionistic view, like Richard Dawkins' view that everything's about genes, and they're trying to bring back Aristotle. Of course, they would say that the essence can change over time, but at least they're trying to change the metaphysics of the whole thing. So it's quite remarkable. But another problem that it can be discussed that is this is mainstream. As I said, I'm not a young Earth creationist. I'm just a regular mainstream evolutionary biologist. But I like to point out the problems because that's how science moves forward. But so if you can share, like another thing that happens, actually, let me just, this one is more interesting than homology. So the thing with the fossil record, right? Because I speak to people and I don't know where they got this idea that the fossil record in general supports a slow, gradual process of evolution, right? And if you read The Origin of Species, which most people don't, the Darwin has a whole chapter to explain the fossil record away. because he admits that the fossil record just shows a bunch of abrupt appearance of organisms, right? And it doesn't match with his idea of a gradual, slowly progressive change. And he says, well, we didn't dig enough, but if we start digging, we're going to find transitions everywhere. Because if evolution, as we understand it in the Neo-Darwinian story, is correct, then you would expect that everything is transitional, right? Because everything's changing constantly. They don't jump from one thing to another, right? So, but when you go to the fossil record, what you find, the most famous one is the Cambrian explosion, right? And people try to explain this away, but this is, you just go to Google Scholar right now and type Cambrian explosion, you're going to find papers from this year or last year still using this terminology, right? You have in an interval that can be, some people say 5 million, let's put it 30 million, different groups of animals appearing, right? Without like no known common ancestor. Like there's in the fossil layer before it, right? Before the Cambrian, Precambrian, the kind of fauna that you had there, it has nothing to do with the organisms that are appearing in the Cambrian, right? So you have things as different as a scorpio and I don't know, a starfish, right? These things are appearing the groups, and you have at least 20 phyla that show up without clear ancestors, right? And this is there, but it's not only that. This is just the Cambrian explosion. But if you go and search for the term explosion, you find, for example, the odontotid explosion, which is like fish with teeth. Avalon explosion, which is the fauna before the Cambrian, right? You have this huge appearance. You have, the marine reptiles that just we don't know where they come from. The pterodactyls, they just appear in the fossil record. We don't know what is the transition between a pterodactyl and a terrestrial organism. Mammals, you have orders of mammals that suddenly appear in the fossil record that we cannot explain very well. The appearance of angiosperms. We're talking about the plants with the trees with flowers, right? Not sorry, the trees, but the plants with flowers. Darwin called the appearance of the angiosperms an abominable mystery, right? And this paper in Nature Plants discusses this thing, because there's nothing like flowering plants before the Cretaceous, and they suddenly appear, and we still don't know how this, where they come from, right? There are hypotheses, and sometimes we find these organisms that, as I said, with the with the sparrows back then, that it took like 1.5 million years to just the color to differentiate. We still find, organisms from 80 million years, 60 million years ago that look pretty much identical to the organisms that we find today. So this paper in Nature Plants on the right, they found in an amber a group of plants that morphologically they are identical to a modern genus, to the point that they could not distinguish it, right? Even the adaptations were similar. So, and you have, mainstream paleontologists who admit, right? You have, Darwin saying that, it doesn't support my theory, and he blames on the imperfection of the geological record. Gaylord Simpson's very famous paleontologist, very staunch evolutionist, he said, there are groups that appear suddenly in the record. His collaborator Eldridge said the same thing. When we see the introduction of evolutionary novelty, it usually shows up with a bang. So, these are things that we have to deal with, and as I said, as a scientist, I'm not satisfied with this. They talk about God of the gaps, but fossil of the gaps, right? Well, just keep, there's nothing there. Sorry, we haven't dug enough, and we're doing that for 150 years, right? Sometimes there are different explanations that they give. You can take the slides out. Sometimes they give out explanation. Well, the production of oxygen by cyanobacteria at one point allowed the organisms to colonize land or do X or Y. Well, the fact that stuff happen doesn't mean that evolution will produce the things. Just because now, let's say, a niche is available for colonization, that doesn't change. Well, I mean, you could argue that there is a constraint has been lifted, but the evolutionary process still has to explain how you make an organism do that. And I think under this Neo-Darwinian framework, I don't think we can explain that, and that's and something we have to just deal with it.
Well, and again, to bring it back to the Catholic faith, like, you know, I know that you're familiar with the Discovery Institute, and I know they're kind of non-denominational, but it's mostly a bunch of well, actually, a couple guys are Catholic. I think Behe is Catholic. I think Meyer. What's his? It's not Urban Meyer. That's a football coach. What was his name? Stephen.
Stephen Meyer.
Stephen. I think he's some sort of
He is
non-denominational.
not. Yeah.
But nonetheless, they go at it from a theistic perspective. And one of their main points, which I think is excellent and valid, is that they're saying, okay, we're taking this information, and we're saying, we're scientists. We are supposed to look at the evidence and say, without our presuppositions, what does this tell us? What it tells us is that none of this is gradual, and it's not there, and then it is there. So they, for someone to then argue for, let's call it like a theistic evolution, that's still not that, because there's no evolution in the sense of a macro thing that the average common sense person would understand. If evolution is sparrows with different colors, then we're all evolutionists, which is then the term is meaningless. But if what we mean is we have this changing of things in transitionary ways to other things which are qualitatively different, we see that nowhere. We see that absolutely nowhere. So even if someone says, I want to reject the sort of traditional Catholic creation idea and take the timeline of the Bible in a more literalistic perspective, and they don't want to accept that, still, when you go back into the old records, you still don't find something that is going to support your quote-unquote theistic evolutionary theory. I honestly don't understand, given the speculative nature of the evidence, given the constant flux and change of the interpretation of the evidence, I don't understand how people latch their theological theories onto this. I find it very strange.
Yeah, it's a bit strange, and as I said, there is a materialistic bias within the academia, particularly within the biological sciences. As I said, even if you're an atheist and you're trying to push like Aristotelian, uh, not even the essentialism in the hard sense, but as I said, there are atheists trying to make it more about the organism rather than this reduction view of the genes and stuff, and they get pushed aside. There is so. Can I show you the slide? So, for example, this this paper I think is in Nature or Science. I forget now. It was in 2015. So they asked the question: does evolutionary theory need a rethink? And a lot of the scientists said, yes, we need changes, right? And the others, usually Neo-Darwinists who are satisfied with this population genetics kind of view of evolution, said, no, it's fine. And then, they have, people can go there and read, they have the different arguments and stuff. I think both of them make good points, to be honest, because there are some problems with the new view as well. The point is that I've read papers from these guys, which what they're pushing is, it's called extended evolutionary synthesis. And I've seen papers, mainstream papers, and they have to excuse themselves, right? They have to write down, look, we are proposing these changes, but we are still part of the game, okay? We are not pushing for, I don't know, ID theory of anything. So I don't know why people feel so threatened within the academia. You should just follow the evidence, right? And that tells you something, right? Because there is an evolution has become for many a religion, right? Because if you're an atheist, that's your genesis story. That's where you come from. So if you threaten that worldview, it's not just a theory that may be under threat. Is your complete worldview of who you are, your moral sense. If you're just an animal that evolved over time, then morality cannot be possibly objective, right? What matters is just reproductive success and do whatever. So I think some materialists within the academia, I'm not claiming here that all of them are. In fact, some of these people who are pushing for this new view of evolution, some of them are not reductionists, right? And some of them are very, amazing scientists, like Dennis Noble in Oxford. You have many of them. They're pushing for a more holistic view of the organism, for example. So just to give you one example of what is being discussed, and I find this absolutely fascinating. I think you're going to get some insights from this. You can interject. So this paper was published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, and it's an excellent journal. and the title is Morphological Novelty Emerges from Pre-existing Phenotypic Plasticity. Phenotypic plasticity is ability of an organism to produce more than one phenotype, right? So it's going to become more obvious when I explain. So if you look at your right, this is a tadpole from a species of frog that occurs in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. They're usually omnivore, so they eat detritus and all sort of stuff, but they can eat a carnivore diet as well. So if you take these organisms and you start feeding them only like shrimps, only a carnivore diet, their morphology changes. So the one on the left is the one that eats detritus and has an omnivore diet. The one on the right is the one which got fed by just shrimps. And you can see that there's some astonishing changes, right? And this is one individual. It's not even under an evolutionary paradigm. That's not an evolutionary change. The organism, the jaw becomes much larger. The organism becomes larger. The intestine size changes. That's what is below there, what the arrows are pointing to. Because if you're omnivore, you need a longer intestine in order to digest this kind of stuff, right? Because cellulose, for example, is much more difficult to break. So carnivores have a smaller intestines. So even the size of the intestine changes just by changing the diet, right? And that was already inbuilt in the organism. That's why they're saying pre-existent phenotypic plasticity, right? So the whole idea here, and I find that fascinating, and I think they're getting to something very interesting, is that what they're saying is, look, this thing originally had the plasticity to produce both of these forms, right? However, if by some sort of mutation or genetic changes, they lose the ability to produce both morphotypes, then they get stuck in one or the other. So that could lead to what we discuss as speciation, right? Imagine if a population, for some reason, loses the ability of producing the omnivore morph, then it's going to become predominantly carnivore, right? And they're saying, look, and we call this genetic assimilation. So the phenotypic change comes before the genetic change. They even call this plasticity first evolution. And I find that fascinating, because it shows there is in the organism there is an inherent plasticity to change quite dramatically. So to give you more examples, this is not necessarily plasticity. This is another mechanism called epigenetics, which is when you're just changing the gene expression. It's not a change at the gene level. It's just how the gene is going to be methylated, for example. It's just little flags for the cell to know whether that gene should be expressed here or now or not. This agouti gene, it's regulated epigenetically. And if you look at these two mice, on your right, they are genetically identical. They're inbred. They're not fully identical because they're not clones, but they're as close as you can get in an inbred line. And they're super different, right? Size, coloration. The reason that they are like that, this difference, is based on the mom's diet, right? So if you give a diet full of a compound that's going to lead to higher methylation, the mice becomes different because the agouti gene is expressed differently. So this gigantic change, which is much larger than what we usually see in mutations, it has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with diet and gene expression, right? And I find that absolutely fantastic. And the same on the left, right? This gradient of how the gene is going to be expressed. So this diagram from this paper, Plasticity and Evolutionary Innovation, all these are plastic changes, right? So let's say the ones in the middle, the butterflies, they used to classify these butterflies are different species because they look so bizarrely different, right? One is blue, a completely different coloration. It turns out that they are the same butterfly. It depends on the wet season, on the dry season, depending one or the other morph is going to be expressed, right? There's some fish that can, like the ones on top of the butterflies, when there's no males present, a female can morph into a male. By the way, that cannot happen with humans.
Good. Yeah, that's good.
Overly excited, we don't have that potentiality. But anyway, it can happen in some species, right? The one on the left is like the sea fleas, the top left. They can change depending if they're predators inside the water or not, they change the density of the armor that they have. The fox on your left as well depends on the weather. They changed completely the coat coloration. So as you can see, these are not, technically speaking, evolutionary changes. They are phenotypic changes by something intrinsic, right? And this extended evolutionary synthesis guys, they're saying, look, this is much more promising, because then they can lose the morphotype, get stuck in another, and then you can have a very fast change because it was already there. And then the Neo-Darwinians ask the right question, which is, well, but where did plasticity come from? And the guys have to go back to the mutation, because that's all they have. So you have this debate going on. Well, I mean, if you're going to go back to just mutation and duplication of genes to explain the plasticity, then you're still a neo-Darwinist, right? And this discussion has been going on. But I find this particularly fascinating, how much change already has there in organisms in potentiality.
So this is fascinating, because what this is showing us in layman's terms, if I understand it, is that even what historically have been pointed to as evidences of what we would call evolution or speciation or something like that, upon further evidence, or with this paradigm which is now accepted as a mainstream hypothesis, some of those old arguments can't even really apply anymore, because we're not seeing a different species in a sense. We're seeing the potential, which is already ingrained into the organism, act differently in different places based on different factors, which again brings us back to something that everybody accepts. Different people, like I know, for example, I'm in Canada. It gets kind of cold here, although we're having one of those global warming winters. It's El Nino or whatever. This has happened a few. I'm 35. I've seen 4 or 5 winters since I was a kid where there wasn't much snow and whatever. It just happens sometimes. Whatever. Point being, if you go into northern Canada, and actually I'll tell 2 stories here. If you go to northern Canada, where like the Yukon is, obviously they have a lot of airports because that's kind of the only way to get there. And if you go young enough, the mechanics will tell you, and guys go up there because you make like $100 an hour. A tomato costs $25, but nonetheless you make like $100 an hour. And they'll go up there, and when they get there, they can't work on the planes without special gloves on, just because it's too cold outside. And you only have you have like 2 months where it's over 4 degrees Celsius or whatever in the daytime. But then if they're there from a young age, if they're there for 10, 15, 20 years, they actually look at their fingers, and their fingers have increased dramatically in size, because they can have more blood pumping essentially to their fingertips. And then they find out later on they're working without gloves, and they can basically put their hands into an ice bucket and not get frozen fingers. I knew another guy. He moved up to Canada for university. So he was like 18 or 19 years old. He's like, his 50s now. And he told me a story how he went to give blood at the campus blood drive, whatever it was on campus. And he had just come to Canada within the last like couple weeks. And something was happening, like they were taking his blood, and it was something like it was evaporating or whatever. It was something weird was happening. And he thought, oh no, I've been drinking too much. And the nurse actually said, oh, where are you from in the southern United States? And he's like, what? And he goes, you're from Florida, or you must be from somewhere like that, because this is what happens until you get used to it. So my point with this is that obviously in different settings, you're going to have changes in what is potential in your ingrained biological nature. But again, this gets us nowhere close to what we would colloquially call evolutionary theory. Now, before I let you jump in there, I do just have to run to the washroom. I'm just going to pause it for 2 seconds, and I'll be right back.
No problem.
Okay, so I'm fasting right now, doing some extra penances stuff, and I'm drinking a lot of coffee and water. Maybe one day I'll evolve where I can drink much more coffee and water and not have to go to the bathroom. What do you think?
Well, it could potentially happen. And as I showed for, with the examples, the changes are dramatic. And the more we study, we realize that this potential for change is ridiculous. And it's still a tadpole, don't get me wrong, but, you're changing your gut morphology by just changing the diet. So you said there is, you could still say that there is a scope for, as I said, evolutionary processes, because ultimately you could cause diversification by losing stuff, right? So, as I said, with the tadpole example, if this population that can be plastic towards one or the other morphotype, if they get separated and they get stuck in one or the other, then you're going to have one population that is omnivore, the other, carnivore, which, as I said, will most likely in the long term be classified as two different species. And this kind of diversification, it certainly happens. So let me show you an interesting example, two actually interesting example of diversification. So we knew from a while back that, for example, the cichlid fishes, that we know where they come from. They're African fishes, and we know that they've colonized some of the lakes, Lake Victoria and other. And it turns out that in both lakes, or the original population diversified, but they diversified to very similar morphologies in both lakes. So if you look at the fishes, right, the fishes on your left, they are very similar to the ones on the right, right? However, genetically speaking or historically speaking, the ones on the left, they are more related to each other because they come from an ancestral population in one lake. The others come from a different population in a different lake. But they somehow converged to the same morphotype in both lakes independently, right? And that's what we tend to call convergent evolution, right? Evolution happened to make two different morphotypes by just similar morphotypes in two different places because the environments were similar. The similar mutations happened by chance in the same environments, and it got selected because of the kind of environment. The same with the lizards over there. The lizards on the left are more related to each other than the ones on the right, but they are very similar, and they're happening in different islands, and they converge to this very similar morphotypes doing very similar things in either island. And now what we are coming to the realization is that this is not Neo-Darwinian mechanisms that's going on. It's not that by pure chance a similar mutation happened independently on each lake or in each island. It is that this lizards and these fishes, they always had the potential to diversify in some of those morphologies. So it can happen by, for example, in the cichlid fishes, there are a lot of morphological changes in the jaw, and they can happen simply by feeding, right? Depending on how you're using the jaw muscles during development when they're young, it will shape the proportion of the skull. So if you're feeding on similar things on each lake, then the similar pressures will be applied to the skull, and then you're going to end up with similar cranial morphologies. And this is phenotypic change, right? And where before we thought, oh, wow, it's a very, very rapid Neo-Darwinian evolution happening independently in two lakes. Now we know, wow, no, actually, the extended synthesis guys are probably right. These things could always potentially do that. It just happened that they, precisely because they can, it explains much better and easily why they converge to these two morphotypes independently, right? And as I said, these changes are, they're still fishes, but some very dramatic changes. And you can see how this can lead to diversification, right? And it's very interesting. And we're still just scratching the surface of what plasticity can do and how these things happen, because we are so fixated before on this reductionist view that is all about the genes and it's all about the alleles changing, and other modes of inheritance, for example, like the epigenetic one with the mom that I've described with the rat, the mice. They were understudied, right? But it's becoming more mainstream now, and it's very fascinating. Um,
One thing that I'm starting to see now, like, I'll use an example here, which I think we're allowed to do on YouTube now because they've changed their rules about COVID. And I never did have a strike, so I shouldn't get one now. So please, COVID gods, be nice to me. Or you YouTube gods. It's probably the same gods. They probably have this. They're probably all Moloch. Anyway, point being, when you would argue with somebody about the virus, and you would specifically bring up the mitigation measures, you would say, well, here is evidence from this source, these mythical lands called Florida, South Dakota, virtually all of Europe, Nicaragua, even though they have the Sandinistas, didn't really do much. Or North, yeah, Nicaragua. I know Belarus never had a lockdown. You look at these places, or the places that opened up pretty quickly, and you'd say, you know, guys, these are not places that exist in the wardrobe in Narnia. They're real places, and they have a completely different experience. They didn't do anything you were doing, and they actually turned out to be okay, and they didn't have all the other associated problems. Well, you would get these wild responses like, well, they would have done better if they had have locked down. Or when you try to argue somebody, but there's no evidence for that because they didn't and they're fine. Or you talk to somebody about, here I am in Canada, it was pretty severe. I know it was up and down in the UK for about a year, but ours lasted like ridiculously for like 2 years. I mean, it was out of this world. And hence that trucker convoy and so forth. And I would try to talk to people, and it was just always begging the question, circular reasoning. Well, there was an answer to every single objection that I would pose, and they'd say, well, it's because we locked down. And it's like, yeah, we don't have any evidence that what would happen if we didn't lock down. And they just go silent kind of thing. And it seems to be something similar with this. You can call anything evolution. Everything is evolution and nothing is evolution. If the moth changes color, it's evolution. If you prove that the moth doesn't actually change color permanently because when it goes back to a different thing, they say, well, that's evolution. If you have the beaks different sizes, this is evolution. And my point is, everything can be used to justify this theory because you can, like a nominalist, essentially define it as whatever you want. So I don't know. I just find it maddening. That's just kind of my rant.
Yes, and it's funny that you mentioned the moth because, again, the moth example, there are other problems. You're actually sticking the moth to the trees to take the pictures. It was all completely unnatural. But the idea that the difference in coloration in the beginning, again, he was argued that it was a Neo-Darwinian thing. It was a mutation probably into what he was. And then they found out it's not. Is a what we call a transposable element, which is a piece of DNA that keeps moving around in the genome that inserted itself in a region and changed again the expression of the gene. Which again, it's funny because just sidetracking. The problem with again, remember, like I'm a mainstream scientist. I just want to know where the truth is, and you should, of course, it's people have previous assumptions and they go into the data with that. But if the data conflicts with your assumption, then you should just follow where the evidence is leading you to. So back in the days, you probably heard about the junk DNA stuff, right? So they looked because of this gene centrism, this idea that it's all about genes, which is again, if you have any notion of good philosophy, that could not possibly be true. Because again, the gene presupposes the cell, which presupposes, that the gene, in order to be rad, needs the machinery, so it cannot be the ultimate cause of an organism, right? So, but it used to be this way, and it still is most of the time. But they only cared about the genes, which are those sections of DNA that can be expressed into a protein. And they realized, for example, in the human genome, 98% of the genome did not do that, right? They don't express proteins. They don't have genes. So again, because of this materialistic evolutionary bias, they assumed immediately that those 98% were junk, probably because of evolution is try and error. So it makes sense that over time junk has accumulated in the genome, and sometimes genes stop working in the lineage. It becomes redundant and gets there, and it doesn't go away completely, but is inactivated or defective. So it just piles up, and they didn't research that part of the genome at all because they assumed, because it fits so well with the idea of random walk of an evolutionary process. So when people decided, no, come on, let's have a look at what's going on there. The ENCODE group, they started looking into this and then realized, well, yeah, they don't code for protein, but they are fundamental for gene expression. So they produce, let's say, microRNAs are going to change how a gene will or not be expressed in a certain time. They're going to change how the the RNA that is produced by from the DNA will be or not spliced. And they realized, wow, it turns out that 80% of this thing is actually functioning. And if you keep studying, we're pretty sure it's going to be 100%, right? So we had for more than a decade, science was blocked by a wrong assumption because people are not looking into these things, right? They were just saying, we know, to the point that when the ENCODE group research started, going, some of the junk DNA people were so upset that they said this cannot possibly be true, because if it's true, it undermines the whole narrative. So they must have made a mistake, and they were completely opposed to the research they were doing, right? This is absolutely anti-science, right? And you mentioned the circular reasoning. Let me show you another thing that we hear this, and I was probably, because I've been talking for too long, so but this whole idea of homology, right? We hear a lot, which is pretty much the idea of similarity. Because remember when I said that, one thing is to talk about changes in gene frequencies over time or allele frequencies, and another is the tree of life. So how do we know that that tree is that tree, right? So the whole gist of this kind of analysis is to search for similarity across organisms, right? So if you look, for example, vertebrates, and Darwin gives the example in one of his chapters, if you look at the structure of the front limb of different kinds of organisms, like a bird, a seal, etc., they have very similar morphology, right? The shape of the bones, the position of the bones are the same. So down, you have at the gene level as well, the homeobox genes that control the development. You have similar genes in the fruit fly that you have in humans. They're homologous. They're similar and they control similar things. So the whole idea of Darwin, which was a speculation, was, well, as a hypothesis, I propose that this similarity is caused by the fact that the common ancestor of vertebrates had the bones at that particular disposition, and therefore they inherited it. And over the course of evolution, the function of each limb changed, but the structure remained similar from the ancestor. Now, see that as a hypothesis, you can't postulate that. But if you suddenly start using that as a proof of evolution, right? Oh, these things are similar, therefore they come from a common ancestor, then you're engaging in circular reasoning. And homology today is considered, those structure that are similar because they were inherited from a common ancestor. So it becomes self-referential, right? And it's funny because when they find similarities, but their own analysis they do not show that they are from an ancestor, let's say, because they end up in very different sides of the tree, then they postulate that, well, then in this case, is not homology, it's convergent. Evolution made the same structure twice, right? So, for example, the animals on your top, is that you have marsupial mammals and the placental mammals. Some of them have very similar morphologies, but according to the current relationship, phylogeny, the placental mammals are more closely related to each other than they are to the marsupial. So in this case, evolution made the same thing twice, right? So it becomes, you always produce some ad hoc explanation for something that doesn't fit the data, right? So similarity means common descent, except when it doesn't, and then it becomes convergence, right? So for Darwin, for example, the eye had evolved one time, right? It was linearly evolving from simplistic complexity. Today, because of the analysis where you're going to put the similarities, comparing multiple genes, whatever, they find out that no, it cannot possibly be the case, just inferential, right? So you're not demonstrating anything. So the eye evolved independently 35 times. Well, because they appear in different sides of the tree, right? So these are being postulated by, the shape of the thing, but the tree that you're making, the algorithm, will always make a tree because you're already assuming that all life is related. So it will produce a tree no matter what you do. And that's why when you change the gene, the trees become completely different from each other. They never converge. Sometimes there are similarities, but depending on you change the gene. But again, you're going to explain away and say, well, maybe the gene evolves slower than the other gene, and that's why they're giving different stories. And you keep creating this ad hoc explanations, but you never question the universal common descent uh, axiom, right? There are few people who are, and they're saying, look, even Eugene Konin, which is the most cited biologist in the world, he's an atheist as far as I know. He said, look, we cannot explain the genetic diversity of viruses by one origin in the beginning. It has to be more than one. And but these ideas are very fringe, and they get really, really, bashed. But and why? I mean, isn't science about trying to refute hypotheses and stuff? And it's very self-referential and sometimes very frustrating.
Well, this is something, this homologous structure thing that you're talking about, the homology. There's another way to talk about it, which is completely valid. And so the idea is that, okay, well, they all kind of look similar, the wings, the legs, whatever. Okay, fine. Well, what else are they supposed to look like? It's like we have an atmosphere. You're either going to walk or you're going to fly or you're going to swim. And you're going to have some sort of appendage. And if you're some sort of animal, it's going to have to attach in a certain way. So, of course, they're all going to look the same. And if there is a designer, he's going to design things that work in the creation that he's made. It's like cars are going to have wheels because that's how you move. And it's like, well, they all descended from the common car. It's like, no, there's just no other way to move. The roads are the roads, or the terrain is the terrain, and you're going to have to make a thing go from there to there. So it's going to either have to roll, it's going to have to crawl, or it's going to have to fly. There's really nothing else you can do. So the actual, this idea that it must be a common ancestor, you could just as easily say it's a common designer. I don't understand why, both of them are hypothesis. At least as a Catholic, I believe that there's this thing called the Bible and that it's actually true. And also with reason and things, we can, go to a creator and all these kinds of things, as Vatican I said. But nonetheless, as you say, this is just an opinion. This is just people looking at things, coloring pictures and saying, because these pictures look alike, well, they must come from the same source. Not necessarily. It's just that there's literally no other way to move in this in this ecosystem that we exist in. So what else would you expect? I find this reasoning to be so limited.
Yeah, you have physical constraints. There's so many ways you can make a wing, at least in the environments that we are aware of. And also there, you know, if organisms were completely different from each other, how would you have, for example, digestion, right? How would you eat something that does not have the building blocks that you use in your body, right? For example, another thing that I tell people, why are things similar? Like under a different paradigm, you could say, let's say if a mouse was completely different from a human in the way it operates and the molecules that it uses on its physiology, you wouldn't have most of medicine because you wouldn't have model organisms to work on. And what would you have to do? Work on babies? Because the fact that we have a lot of stuff is because we test on animals. And the reason we can test on animals and transfer that to humans is because they work in similar ways, right? And so, of course, you're going to have similar genes if you both have livers, right? Livers, why would you build a liver in completely different ways, right? So, it's not a very convincing argument. As I said, as a hypothesis for the similarity is absolutely fine. The problem is that the hypotheses have taken the shape of an axiom, right? And it's unfalsifiable because you cannot go back in time and say, well, this thing is actually related to another. So, for example, the most common example of evolution that we hear in the media is the evolution of whales, right? And you get the pachycetus or this like old whales, whatever they call it, they were still walking four legs. And the only reason that they call them whales is because they have a specific bone on their ear that look like whale bones, which when you look structurally, the fact that the whale has that bone in that particular shape or density is because it helps here underwater. So if these organisms that they are analyzing also has like a semi-aquatic lifestyle, so it would make sense that it has a similar, bone structure to a whale, and something related to the skull as well as a bit. So that's how they define that this thing is a whale, and the people don't understand that because the fossil doesn't speak, right? It cannot say, well, I came from this other thing. It's just a matter of looking for similarities. Are they shareable? across some groups, what are the groups that share more similarities, and that's how you build trees. But as I said, the premise of the algorithm is that we'll try to maximize how you're going to put these groups together in order to make the similarities be more present here, minimize the number of changes, whatever algorithm you're using. So and if it doesn't, if it's fail, you're just going to produce a tree without proper branches. But they would just say, well, we didn't have enough data, so let's try again, add more genes, and etc. So it's complicated, and it's a paradigm it's completely ingrained. And as I said, there are mainstream evolutionary biologists who are atheists, and they're saying, look, maybe life had multiple origins. Why does it have to be one? So effectively, they believe in a miracle that it happened just once, or some of them are even postulating multiple universes in order to make the probabilities more acceptable for origin of life. It's crazy, and it's very disappointing because you're not allowed to point out the flaws. And even if you're, I am an evolutionary biologist, I work with mutation and stuff, and I'm just trying to understand how nature works. But if you go slightly away from the paradigm, you get bashed quite easily. It's very, very frustrating.
So we've been going for almost an hour and a half, and I got time, but I let's maybe if we, I mean, I think we've given the viewers. I mean, we've got a PhD from Oxford in evolutionary biology. I think they're getting information that's going to be very helpful. But the question about humans coming from animals, that sort of thing, from other animals. I know this is a very broad question, but if we could boil it down, like, what is the strongest opinion that you have, or that is found in the science, that casts great doubt or makes essentially impossible this idea that human beings like you and me, come from something that's non-human?
Well, there are quite a few. For example, it's very difficult to explain human intelligence on a materialistic framework. So, you know, the capacity to abstraction language, for example, language requires abstraction, and so how did this happen? We have no idea. On a The only hypothesis that is given is that the brain got larger because they were eating more meat, and because the brain got larger and more connections, therefore intelligence grew exponentially. But that's very materialistic, right? Because you're pretty much saying that you can reduce intelligence to this size of the brain, but a whale has a larger brain than a human. They're not more intelligent than you are. And if you're committed to that, then you're saying the midgets are dumber than the average person because they are smaller, right? And I don't think materialist a materialist would be happy with that conclusion.
Sorry,
Um,
there was a phone call come. I exited out.
okay, no problem. Um, so yeah, language, but I think one of the biggest problem, and actually Alfred Wallace, which was the co-founder of modern Darwinism, Wallace and Darwin presented natural selection to the world together in Oxford, I think, or the Royal Society, I don't remember exactly. He noticed that human beings have very weird traits, right? We have very thin skin. We don't have claws. We do not have fangs. We're very fragile, right? We're not particularly fast. So if you're evolving humans from a population of apes, which are quadruped, very strong. A chimpanzee can beat you to death in a minute. They're, I think, 7 times stronger. They are very agile and stuff. So on the evolutionary perspective, how can you gain those characteristics that are clearly not very advantageous in a savanna, right? Slowly. Because the only reason we can get away with having this very fragile body, this upward posture, the lack of fangs, the lack of scales, is because we have intelligence. So we can make artifacts, right? We can make guns. We can fly with, helicopters, planes. So we can compensate for the fragility of our bodies with our intelligence. But according to the common mainstream evolutionary idea, the intelligence came, for example, before bipedalism. So how can a population slowly evolve bipedalism in a savanna, right? How can you outrun the quadrupeds if you're like not fully bipedal. I'm not even arguing how you can evolve bipedalism to begin with, because you have to change pretty much the whole bone structure of the center of gravity, the whole, it's going to change so many things. But let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that it could do that slowly. But in a evolutionary idea or gradualism, then you at one point have a very suboptimal, non-bipedal, no fully quadruped organism. How would that organism survive in a savanna packed with predators and out-survive the fully quadruped apes that they are diverging from? That's a big problem that Wallace, he was a materialist, an evolutionist, the founder, and he realized this cannot be. And he became some sort of spiritualist and said, well, man has to be a special kind of guided evolution from intelligence, whatever. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, and one of the examples I've always two examples I've always gone back to is the camel and the lungfish. Are you familiar with the lungfish?
Yeah.
You look up the lungfish, the thing is insane. It basically becomes mud somehow and doesn't have a heartbeat for 6 months at a time, and then it's rehydrated. I mean, that is just something that it's bananas. It is insane. I don't have enough fantasy in my mind and speculative mathematical potential to even postulate a scenario wherein you're going to have some sort of fish that will survive somehow when it's dead with dryness, and then sort of become part of embed itself into the soil and stop having. I mean, it's just the amount of things that would have to happen. I don't have enough faith, put it that way, in impossible things to believe that would be random. It doesn't make any sense. And then also with the camel, I mean, camels obviously they can hold water for a very long time and they don't have to drink for weeks on end, sort of thing. That to me, if I'm just postulating a scenario wherein you've got some proto-camel thing that's living somewhere where there would have to have been water, because no mammal is going to survive in a place without water. I don't know. Does the camel decide to go out into the desert for does it decide to go where there's no water and just sort of hold it for a while and then comes back and does some more? I mean, or is it in an environment where the water starts to go away, but we know when we watch the migrations of species, when there's no water, they just leave. So why on earth did the stupid camels decide to stay? I mean, it's one of the million examples where I just shake my head and I say, this is so stupid. There is no possible way that this is indicative of the behavior that we see of animals now. I mean, goodness gracious, the environmentalists are screaming at us for using plastic bags and cars that use gasoline because it's making the poor little field mouse, have to go down the road instead of being where they usually were. And I'm thinking, as human beings, what do you do when the situation's bad? You leave. But somehow the stupid camel says, I'm just going to tough it out and I'm going to live in this hot climate and I'm just going to somehow survive impossibly and make sure that my kids are even better at not drinking for a long period of time. And it's one of the million examples. What you bring up about human beings, we are completely inadequately formed for our environment. I'm in Canada. There's a reason why Canada they estimate that there was, at the time of, let's call it, contact with the Europeans, between 100,000 and 500,000 people. Let's just call it 500,000 just to give the lefties their due, because they want there to be more people here because it makes us look more evil because we took over, blah, blah, blah. Fine. Yes. Canada is 33 times the size of Italy. The province of Ontario alone, the one that I live in, is 3 times the size of Texas, and everything's bigger in Texas. You would have been able to walk for months at a time without ever encountering another human being. The vast majority of the country is still completely uninhabited. And the reason why the native populations are found in higher numbers as you get more south in the United States and obviously into Latin America is because human beings just simply can't survive here. We just cannot survive in a place like this without the amenities of heating and cooling and all these kinds of things. Agricultural production, which they didn't have very much in this part of the world. And when you look at the native populations, you can see the writings of the Jesuit missionaries and things like that came over. They talk about how the population was on life support. They were very small. They had a lot of handicaps in their intellectual capacities because of lack of blood sugars and things like that. They couldn't survive. Human beings are not made to live like animals. Yet somehow it's supposed to be some sort of evolutionary process which presupposes some sort of improvement, that we're going to become completely unsuited to our environment. And the idea that you're going to have this convergence of, at the exact time, you're going to have a leap in intellectual capacity to the point where you can somehow outsmart the tiger who will eat you for breakfast because you can't even run away. Anyway, there's just layers upon layers of mathematical improbability, if not impossibility, if we're not being fantastical. And you add to that all of the problems and the redefinitions and so forth in the biological side of evolution. I just don't see how the theory is tenable. And I really can't see how someone is not only going to hold to it privately, but then also is going to interpret the scriptures and then evangelize the Catholic faith using this fantastical gobbledygook.
Yeah, we're avoiding speaking about theology, but on specifically human evolution, you have so many theological problems, right? Yeah, one of the most simple is Our Lady would cease to be the only person ever conceived without sin, right? Forgetting about our Lord, of course, but yeah. So there are many problems, but yes, as I said, I'm citing Alfred Wallace, who was the co-founder of modern evolutionary theory, and he was like, you would have to lose adaptive traits and gain some very wacky things without the intelligence being even there in order to compensate for those traits. And we're not talking about, you're talking about the savannah of Africa, if that the story goes, it's true. So it's a very nasty environment, and you have this creature with no, with nails and no claws. I cannot just beat the chimpanzee to death, and so there is a big problem on that front. But yeah, again, you know, you find fossils that have this mosaic of features, and it may be an intermediate, and etc. But again, you either have bipedal creatures or you don't. And I'm the opinion in all these fossils that if they are bipedal and they're making tools, then they are humans. And it leads to a very people don't think about it, right? But they represent this early people as savages, right? With looking like monkey-like, dragging a woman by the hair and with the clubs and stuff. So as Catholics, if these are human beings, they have immortal souls and they have dignity, and they're being depicted, like if you had your grandmother being depicted as a half-naked woman in, with big wig and half chink in a journal, you'd be pretty upset about it, right? And what people don't realize is that, they had because they assume, this progression in technology and stuff, even though a lot of the things don't get preserved, particularly if you're talking about millions of years. If you have a hut made of wood, this thing's not going to be preserved for you to find it, right? But, let's assume that, yes, you have a progression of tool use that goes from, just using whatever, rocks that are sharpened in order to cut stuff. Many tribes in the world today have that kind of technology. So if you call this hominids, brutes, half stupid, that are in between monkeys and humans, then you're effectively saying that those tribes of humans I don't know, some parts of Africa, they are just stupid, right? Because according to your own paradigm, these tribes have been there for thousands of years, and they haven't moved on from just using simple tools to do stuff. So are you willing to call them stupid half animals? That's how you get to scientific racism, and it happened in the past. Particularly in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you had eugenics. You had the idea that black people were more related to monkeys than the whites were, and some of them got exterminated in Africa. There is a famous case of a pygmy that got exposed in a New York zoo with a chimpanzee, Ota Benga. He committed suicide at one point, but he was shown as a link between the monkey and the man, and they put him in a cage in a zoo. He's a human being with a chimpanzee as his buddy. You can look it up; it's in Wikipedia. So it's very, very nasty, and people don't think about it. Particularly Catholics. You don't understand the consequences of your ideas.
Yeah, yeah. And as G.K. Chesterton said, the only thing that we know about the missing link is that it is missing. You know, you can, and I can't remember when this is going to air because this is part of my larger series on my channel about creation and evolution. I did an interview with a fellow named John Wynn where we looked at the hominids and using only the mainstream stuff. And this guy's been doing this for, I mean, decades. He's been doing this stuff since like the 80s. And it's just like, this is his wheelhouse and he knows what he's talking about. And he showed only mainstream information from all the major publications, blah, 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 blah. And he showed that even within the realm, because you said if it's bipedal and it's making tools, this thing is human. He showed just that. You know, a different paradigm. You're talking about strict biology. He's talking about more about, the anthropological outlook on these things. And he showed that even within the mainstream literature, you can find pieces here and there and everywhere where you can say there isn't even such thing as that different type of hominid thing because it disappears because the differences gets explained away anyway. So when you combine the fact that you have this biological impossibility of evolution, you have this anthropological impossibility of these different types of sort of quasi-human things, which really are just humans, and you add to that, elements of paleontology with the different structures and things like that we see that are going back millions and millions of years according to the mainstream timeline. And then we use our reason. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I think you mentioned at one point Heraclitus as one of the ancient philosophers. This stuff was dealt with. This stuff was dealt with by the big smarty pants Greek philosophers and philosophers of antiquity. And there were folks like Lucretius, there were folks like Democritus, there were folks like the Epicureans, and they were arguing for some sort of evolutionary thing. They wouldn't call it that, it was different types of things, but it's the exact same theory. And they had paleontologists. You can actually read in Augustine's memoirs, he actually talks about being on bone digs and talking about fossils he found. Anyway, it's just, there's nothing new under the sun. And the more and more we learn, that this evolutionary theory stuff is suspect to say the least. And if we understand evolution from the sense of, this idea of things becoming things that they're not, as is commonly said, there's just no basis for this. And anyway, that's the end of my soapbox. But Ralu, is there anything else that you'd like to say before we sign off here?
Yeah, no, just a small comment that, this business of and the fossils are interpreted according to the bias, right? So, for example, Lucy, the Australopithecus, they used to draw her as a half monkey. Then they started studying a lot of her anatomy and realized that she's fully bipedal and that they changed the way they represent her, right? And this business of, they have a very small brain case and small brain. Well, they forget to mention that Lucy was 1 meter tall, right? So if she's, smaller people have, as I said, smaller brain cases. So that doesn't mean that they're less intelligence, right? Because and now I move away from the biology. If Thomistic metaphysics and Bible Catholic, we know that our soul is immaterial, substantially. Our intellect and our will are immaterial, so they cannot be reducible to the brain. So yeah, I look forward to a day that we can be able to do biology with a better informed, not saying you should bring the Bible to this, but at least that different philosophical frameworks are allowed within academia without you being a materialist, reductionist, but the data is pushing people towards that anyway. As I said, the Linnean Society is discussing goal-directed evolution, So we'll see where it's going to lead. But anyway, yeah, thank you for having me, and sorry for boring people with such long and convoluted explanations. But if you want to talk about the science, is usually what you have to do.
Well, I thank you very much because as I was saying at another point we were chatting, I was called a very unserious creationist by a very famous Catholic apologist for my creationism. And granted, I'm not very evolved, Romulo. I've got this big beard. It's adapted to my environment, and sometimes I do drag my knuckles on the floor when my back is hurting. I can't help it. But I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could find a Catholic who knows his faith, who also has a PhD in the very topic from arguably the most prestigious institutions in the world. And lo and behold, you exist. So maybe I'm an unserious person, but I think you're pretty serious, and I think your claim should be taken very seriously. So I look forward to all my critics and detractors out there, to your debunking videos of a man who obviously knows more about the topic than you do. So, Romulo, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Is there anywhere? I know you have a Portuguese language channel. There's perhaps going to be some Portuguese speakers. Where can people see some stuff that you do?
Yeah, I have a channel that I discuss, a bit of my Catholicism, my conversion, a bit of the science, trying to explain that doesn't conflict with our faith. It's Science and Philosophy, Dr. Romulo, but in Portuguese, Ciência e Filosofia, Dr. Romulo. You can link the email that you used to contact me on the description of this video, and then people can just send me messages if they want to ask something specific.
Perfect. Last thing I forgot to ask. So you live in England. What is your favorite food in England? Do you actually like English food, or do you pine for the days of food back home?
I mean, why would you move to the UK if not for the food and the weather? That's why I'm here. I mean, fish and chips all the way down, and shepherd's pie and all that stuff. I joke that Scotland has its national dish, haggis, which is like the intestine of a goat wrapped around some food. To be entirely honest, I consider that. I don't even have to do fasting for Lent because being in the UK, you're already offering it up every day with the food they have here, unfortunately. So I don't like anything.
Well, maybe they're just not as evolved as Brazil, Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Till next time, God bless you all.